Thanks everyone for coming out on a cold, well, for Texas day to listen to what I believe will be a very productive talk by my friend Dr. Richard Vedder on the coming crisis in higher education. This event is part of the Baugh Center for Free Enterprise's Free Enterprise Forum, and it's being co-sponsored by the Department of Economics as well as the Department of Educational Leadership. My name is Daniel Bennett, and I'm a research professor with the Baugh Center. The Baugh Center has been around for about 20 years with the intention to facilitate the development of new businesses as well as to further the goals of established firms. Now, the free enterprise component of the Baugh Center came online a few years ago due to the generous funding of numerous donors, and the goal of the Baugh Center is to become a national leader in the preservation of the competitive free enterprise system through research, teaching, and informing public policy. This is the Free Enterprise Forum, which is one component of the Baugh Center's portfolio, and allows us to bring to campus renowned guests such as Dr. Vedder to speak on a range of topics related to free enterprise, as well as regulation, innovation, and human well-being. We also host a couple of other events that I'll briefly tell you about, and I think they're cycling through the screens here. One is the Confessions of an Entrepreneur speaker series, which features real entrepreneurs, many of them local, who come to share their stories. We also, every semester, host the McLean Scholars Reading Group. And so if you're interested in staying informed about our programs, we'll be passing around some clipboards, so please sign up for our mailing list. I'm very honored to introduce our guest this evening, Dr. Richard Vedder. I say this sincerely because I'm not only a fan of Dr. Vedder's work, but Dr. Vedder is actually largely responsible for turning me on to the economic way of thinking and to inspire me to pursue a career as an academic. Now, when I told Dr. Vedder that I wanted to do a PhD in economics, he was very encouraging. He said, "Daniel, you're going to go to Florida State and you're going to work with Jim Gortney." And I did. Dr. Vedder is a distinguished professor of economics at Ohio University. He's the founding director of the Center for College Affordability and Productivity, and he's still an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He's authored more than 200 scholarly articles, including a few that he and I have worked on together, and 8 books, including Going Broke by Degree, Why College Costs Too Much. He's also written probably thousands of articles for the popular press, appearing in the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Inside Higher Education, and countless other publications. He also appears widely in the electronic media, and in 2013, the Wall Street Journal referred to Dr. Vedder as America's foremost expert on the economics of higher education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Vedder.
Hey, thank you, Daniel. I never had a former student say such nice things about me. That's kind of cool. I'm delighted to be here. Grateful that the weather it was a bit eventful getting here, actually. Although I was amused listening to the Dallas TV this morning. Oh my God, crisis has come. It's hit 27 degrees. When I left Ohio, it was -3. So, you know, everything's relative. Now, in the interest of consumer protection, I think I probably should tell you that I am an economist. And economists have some good qualities, but they suffer from 3. By the way, I will use no PowerPoint today, although they're paying me an honorarium here. It isn't a really large honorarium, so I'm going to use, instead of using PowerPoint, I'm going to use my fingers. We call this West Virginia PowerPoint, back where I'm from. The economists suffer from 3 deficiencies. First, they're often wrong. Second, they're very often boring. And third, they're often viewed as hard-hearted and insensitive. Now, regarding the first point, and this is actually factually true, this isn't a joke, the English economist Thomas Malthus, in his essay on population in 1798, said that the passion between the sexes You know something about that. The law of diminishing returns will lead to a situation where there will be continued economic misery and subsistence incomes, whereupon, almost immediately thereafter, the English economy began growing at an unprecedented rate that has continued for over 200 years. Malthus was wrong. So let's go on to 1929. The Dean of American Economists, Irving Fisher, said in the New York Times yet, quote, "The stock market is on a permanently high plateau," whereupon it promptly began the biggest decline in American history, major indices falling over 80%. In 1985, Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Samuelson, the greatest Keynesian economist ever lived, if there is such a term, in his iconic textbook proclaimed, and I quote Samuelson, "The Soviet planning system is a powerful engine for economic growth." 7 years later, there was no Soviet Union, much less planning system, and virtually everyone today, even my drinking buddy, Vladimir Putin, believes that Soviet planning promoted economic growth in any way. Moving in your lifetime, in early 2009, President Obama's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Christina Romer, said that if the Obama stimulus package was adopted, the unemployment rate would not rise above 8%, whereupon it promptly went above 8% for 43 consecutive months, the longest time it had been above 8% since the Great Depression. So, you have been warned. American universities are considered the best in the world. Large numbers of foreign students from all over Earth enroll in them. American academic scholars dominate the winners of the Nobel Prize. World rankings suggest that about a half of the top 100 universities in the world are located in the United States. Yet I'm here today to suggest that American higher education is in many ways a troubled enterprise. Our colleges and universities suffer from 4 large problems that are causing a crisis that will inevitably lead to major changes in the delivery of higher education services in the years ahead. By the way, I will have a book out on this before the end of this year. If this actually turns you on, it's actually pretty depressing. I don't expect to sell very many copies of the book, but that's what us professors do, write books. The 4 problems. Number 1. Our universities are vastly too expensive, often costing twice as much per student compared with institutions in other industrialized democracies, and vastly more than a generation ago. Number 2, although there are important exceptions, students attending college in contemporary America on average are learning relatively little, spend little time in academic preparation, and in some disciplines are indoctrinated by highly subjective ideology. Learning about the foundations of our civilization and respect for moral absolutes and acquiring knowledge based on universally accepted factual evidence has deteriorated. Third, partly as a consequence of mediocre preparation, but more a result of massive public overinvestment, there is a huge mismatch between student expectations about job opportunities after graduation and labor market realities, leading to massive underemployment, with many graduates taking relatively unskilled jobs as baristas, retail sales clerks, and Uber drivers. Fourth, the suppression of unpopular or politically incorrect views is occurring on some campuses, impeding free speech and the expression of ideas. Campuses are historically safe spaces for expressing and debating unpopular ideas in an environment of civility and goodwill. That is increasingly untrue on some campuses. Moreover, the public resources used to subsidize and sustain higher education will not almost certainly grow as much in the future as in the past, partly because of disenchantment with colleges arising out of the four problems I just mentioned, but also because the national economy has been dramatically weakened over time. From 1660 to 2000, the American economy grew well over 3% a year, adjusting for inflation, of course. Since 2000, it's grown about 2% a year. In addition, the population's aging, soaring public health expenditures, various dysfunctions of the welfare state reduce the fiscal capacity and the political will of governments to fund colleges and universities. Despite pleas from the left, people like Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton for free tuition, I predict fiscal and political realities will make it very unlikely that goal will be achieved, which actually I think is good. Now let me talk a little bit about these four problems. Then I'll briefly talk about a few other higher education issues involving waste or scandal. Maybe I'll briefly discuss some changes that might mitigate some of these problems and make some observations about the future. But remember what I said at the beginning about economists and their ability to predict the future. It's not actually entirely straightforward to calculate the changing cost of higher ed. Many students get big discounts from the published tuition fee, often called the sticker price. I hear it's about 45% on average here at Baylor. Those discounts on average have grown over time. But in addition to tuition fees, there's also mandatory other fees that are often involve non-instructional charges. Many universities also, of course, charge rising room and board fees to students, not to mention expenses to cover book costs. It may be more appropriate, rather than to look at the cost to individuals, but to the cost to society of college, including the outlays by governments and philanthropists. Despite all these complications, it's unquestionable that the cost of college has risen after adjusting for inflation. The Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that tuition fees have grown 3% a year or more annually after adjusting for inflation over the last 40 years. Since 1978, fees have roughly tripled after inflation. By the way, that would imply the tuition at Baylor in 1978, if it followed that model, would have been about $13,000 or $14,000 in today's dollars. Instead of what, 41? So at the same time, real household income has risen very slowly, so the burden of college has actually grown. It's harder to pay for college today than it was 4 decades ago. Before 1978, fees also increased, partly because of a characteristic of higher education noted by the late Princeton economist William Baugh. According to Baugh, teaching is a form of theater. I'm an actor. I'm acting like in a theater, giving you a monologue. It takes as many actors today to perform Shakespeare's King Lear as it did over 4 centuries ago when it was written. There's no possibility of replacing actors with machines. So reducing labor usage is difficult in higher education, but university salaries must rise over time in a growing economy in order to be competitive in labor markets. That pushes costs up. I've estimated the cost of going to college rose between 1840 and 1978 at 1% a year, adjusting for inflation. But because of economic growth, the incomes were going up about 2% a year, so the cost of the burden of going to college was falling. Although the fees were rising, the burden was falling. It takes a smaller proportion of our income to buy almost anything today than it did decades or centuries ago, since incomes have almost constantly risen. So from 1840, when the tuition at Princeton was, guess, $40 a year. To 1978, the burden of attending college had declined despite rising fees. Since then, it's risen considerably. Now, I tracked the tuition fees and income change at a typical university, Purdue, from 1939 to the present. From 1939, which was still in the Great Depression, to the early 1950s, tuition fees fell from about 22% of the per capita income of residents in Indiana down to about 8%. Burden was becoming lower. Tuition fees were rising, but less rapidly than income. After 1954, the fees started going up a little faster, in fact, even a little faster than income. By 1978, it took 11% of your income, per capita income in Indiana to pay the Purdue tuition. But that's still only half of what it was in the Great Depression. From 1978 to 2013, though, fees soared, so by the latter year, it took 26% of the per capita income in Indiana to pay Purdue's tuition, more than in the Great Depression. College is becoming dramatically less affordable. There is a happy ending in this story, which I'll get to in a minute. Purdue is the rare university that has done something different. I'll come back to that at the end. Now, returning to the national scene, we see the same picture. Fees have gone up as a percentage of income over time. They've continued to rise. Right now, they're somewhere over 20%. Typical tuition fees at American universities are typically around 20% of median household income, to use a different statistical measure. The bottom line is that college is becoming less affordable. Maybe it's changed in the last year or two. I'll come to that at the end. Now, why has this happened? The Baugh argument is this is a service industry, little opportunity for productivity improvement. That argument might explain those 1% tuition increases of the earlier period, but not certainly the 3% that we've had in modern times. If tuition fees had continued to go up at 1%, tuition fees today would be roughly half of what they actually are. So, and the $1.4 trillion student loan debt problem would be largely non-existent. I would argue that the online teaching revolution and other technological advances make it possible for professors to teach far more students than decades ago. Moreover, only about a third of university budgets actually finance teaching. The vast expansion of administrative staffs has actually lowered labor productivity in modern universities. There are 50 Title IX coordinators at Harvard College, 39 mentors, whatever that means. I don't know what they do. 100 people into Title IX enforcement at Harvard College. They're checking on the guys to be sure they're not doing anything naughty with the girls or something. I don't know what it is, but there's 100 people doing this at Harvard College. Now, university presidents love to say falling state appropriations are the culprit, as fees have to go up to compensate for reduced public support. There's a little bit of truth to this proposition, but it's misleading and exaggerated. I would note that private universities don't get a dime of public support. Baylor doesn't get money from Texas, yet their tuition fees have also risen substantially over the time, almost as much as public institutions. In most states, absolute state appropriations are at an all-time high, but on a per-student basis, they're often a little bit lower because of enrollment increases. I would note also that American universities, state universities, spend considerably more educating students than universities in similar industrialized democracies. Administrative staffs have soared over recent years, and I could go on and on. Now, if the Baugh thesis about this being a service industry and the falling state appropriations thesis don't explain much of what's going on with tuition fees, what does? The evidence to me is overwhelming that the main culprit is the federal government. The main problem is that tuition fees have risen so dramatically, largely as a consequence of federal student financial assistance programs, programs that began in a small way in the 1960s, but started to grow massively after a major expansion in loan eligibility in 1978. Universities simply raised their fees aggressively to capture the money, the aid given to them by the federal government, or lent to them by the federal government. Studies published both by the National Bureau of Economic Research and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York confirm what is usually known as the Bennett hypothesis, named after, not this Bennett, named after the former education senator, Secretary Bill Bennett, who 40 years ago asserted that rising student financial aid from the government is captured by colleges in the form of higher tuition fees. Now, rapidly rising tuition fees have provided added resources to college that have been largely distributed to powerful constituencies within university communities who control the allocation of resources, who think they own the universities. And these are like dividend payments to them, as the late Henry Manny would put it. The biggest single gainer has been the university administrative apparatus, which has grown dramatically on virtually every campus. At my rather typical university, in the mid-70s, there were about 2.5 faculty members for every administrator. Now, the number of administrators easily exceeds the number of faculty. Dramatic changes. Now, universities are in the knowledge acquisition and dissemination business, but it is embarrassing how little we know, and they know, or at least reveal, about how much the students actually learn while in school. Do seniors know a lot more than freshmen? Can they reason or think critically better as a consequence of their college education? The evidence seems to be rather scanty. But what little we do know seems not particularly comforting. In a very large and much publicized study done for the Social Science Research Council involving two reputable scholars, they were reputable scholars, although they were sociologists, which makes them somewhat less reputable in my opinion. These scholars looked at gains in student performance over the college years as measured by the Collegiate Learning Assessment, or CLA test. The CLA measures critical reasoning and writing skills. The study showed that most seniors performed only marginally better than freshmen, with a large minority of the student population showing no improvement at all, about 40%. The U.S. Department of Education, which generally does harmful and debilitating things, which I will talk about later and already have, does do something useful every once in a while. They do something called an adult literacy survey. And the most recent one showed that the levels of literacy among college graduates has declined. A civic literacy test administered by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute looked at basic knowledge of students concerning American civic institutions, our heritage, asking questions like, in what half century did the Civil War occur? The test results were similarly dismal to those on the CLA or the adult literacy survey. Seniors knew little, or at some schools, no more than freshmen. I think Yale showed decline. The years spent in New Haven led to negative learning at $60,000 a year. Now, there are two well-documented empirical observations highly consistent with the notion that collegiate learning is probably less than it used to be. First of all, grade inflation has been substantial. In the middle of the last century, a typical college student had a grade point average of about 2.5 on a 4-point scale, somewhere between a B- and C+ average. Today, the average GPA exceeds 3.0, above a B average. Now, of course, it could be that students today are studying harder and learning more, which would justify higher grades. But the evidence on learning plus other data suggests this is not the case. Indeed, several data sources suggest that the college students today spend dramatically less time on their academic work than was the case a half a century ago. In the 1960s, the typical student spent about 40 hours a week in class writing papers or studying. Today, the figure is more like 27 hours, 1/3 less. Students are getting much higher grades while doing much less work, doing less for more. Now, the typical college student then spends about 800 hours a year on academics, less time than the average 8th grader. Many students and their families are spending $50,000 a year for school, over $60 for every hour devoted to academic work, $1 for every minute of study or class participation. Now, guidance counselors, politicians, investment gurus always tell kids they must go to college in order to succeed. Yet the number of college graduates has grown faster than the number of high-paying jobs in the professional, managerial, and technical fields, where college graduates usually work. In 1970, for every 150 taxi drivers, there was one college graduate. Today, the figure is, in 2010, the figure was 25 out of every 150. And the number is no doubt higher today. The Federal Reserve Board of Bank of New York has calculated an underemployment rate. The last figure I saw for last year was 43% for recent graduates. More than 2 out of 5 graduates are doing jobs traditionally performed by high school grads. Moreover, while many claim that the modern economy most jobs require college-level skills, the facts suggest otherwise. From 2007 to 2015, new job postings were up 71% for jobs typically filled by high school graduates, but 27% up for those typically filled with, by those with bachelor's degrees or more. Electricians and welders make more than typical recent college graduates most often, and the general neglect of technical vocational education in America has created a shortage of skilled workers, which means some with relatively inexpensive post-secondary training and specific skills are getting good jobs. With a young student, a colleague of mine, I published a recent study as well as an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that showed that the earnings differentials between graduates of colleges and graduates of high schools actually fell in inflation-adjusted terms from the late 1990s to 2015. The cost of going to college was rising sharply, but the earnings advantage from such a degree was falling or at best stagnating. The return on financial investment for going to college seems to be falling. And as a consequence, probably, of this and other things as well, enrollments in America and colleges have fallen for 6 consecutive years, a decline that is unprecedented in a modern American peacetime history. Now, when I started researching higher ed nearly 2 decades ago, by the way, I've been teaching. I'm in my 53rd year of teaching. I still teach. I'm in my 53rd year. I had 41 students in my class in American Economic History this fall. And when I started teaching, researching all this stuff, I almost exclusively talked about rising costs and academic inefficiencies. And they're a huge problem, and they will be for some time. But also what worries me a little bit is maybe even more fundamental. Universities are increasingly not performing their most vital function of all, serving as an impartial forum for the free flows of all kinds of ideas, including some deeply unpopular ones. Competition is always better than monopoly, whether it be in the marketplace for goods and services or in the marketplace for ideas. When only one set of ideas is permitted or heard, innovation is stifled, and those with alternative ways of thinking are frustrated. Society loses the ability to discover new things and enjoy the give and take of varying viewpoints that is at the heart of a vibrant learning community. And I could go on and on. Michael Bloomberg spoke at the 2014 Harvard commencement, and he said, and I quote Bloomberg, "A university cannot be great as long as its faculty is politically homogeneous. There are, first of all, too many schools where the faculty are of similar sort of mindset, most typically a highly interventionist progressive orientation, very few of other viewpoints. Another problem is the intolerance of alternative viewpoints has led to disinviting or shouting down speakers or not conforming to the politically correct thoughts of the moment." And so we've had all sorts of problems on that. I could go on. My dear friend and Peter Klein here, your professor here, used to teach at the University of Missouri. He can tell you a few things about what happened there that it sort of personifies, I think, all of this. But now, I want to make clear, though, having said that, I don't think there's anything wrong with a community of like-minded people starting their own school. Indeed, one of the virtues of American higher education is that we have a variety of schools with different academic cultures and ways of doing things. Our faith-based universities, like Baylor, are an important part of the American higher education landscape and are particularly adept at furthering the goal of higher education that's often ignored, promoting goodness and virtue. That said, even schools like TCU and Baylor benefit from having their students and faculty having civil discussions with those that hold alternative or different religious or political traditions. I started out, by the way, saying that economists were not only wrong often, but they're often boring. And let me tell you a quick story about that related to me by a president of a Federal Reserve Bank. A woman had just received devastating news from her physician that she had a brain tumor and only had 6 months to live. The woman said to the doctor, "Doctor, isn't there anything you can do?" He replied, "I can't help you medically, but I have some good advice." She eagerly said, "What is it?" He said, "Marry an economist and move to North Dakota." She said, "Why would I want to do that?" He said, "You won't live a day longer, but it sure will seem like a long, long time." Now, this discussion of four issues regarding higher ed skips over many, many other specific problems. Let me just list a few. Resources are vastly underutilized. Students don't study much, faculty increasingly don't teach much, and many buildings are mostly unused several months of the year, seldom on Fridays or weekends. Big-time intercollegiate athletics is expensive, involves often morally questionable exploitation of youth by adult mentors enriching themselves, and in some cases probably even causing serious long-term health issues. Most faculty publications are seldom read or cited, contribute almost nothing to society, and add enormously to instructional costs because of low teaching loads justified in the name of research. University decision-making is cumbersome, and governing boards are usually rubber stamps for the administration and are clueless about some real issues facing the campus community. Most campuses have more administrators than faculty, people who neither teach nor do research, the foundational tasks of higher education. Accreditation is a joke. It is often expensive and an impediment to learning and innovation. And also, powerful university interests often seek to use rising revenues to enrich themselves at the expense of students, taxpayers, and donors, contributing to the very substantial rise in recent years in negative public attitudes towards universities. Okay, what can we do? Is there anything we can do? I was asked a question earlier. Is there anything we can do? It's debatable. It's an actually debatable question. But I have three general observations. First, while government subsidies mute the ability of market forces to work effectively, These forces are necessarily very strong and are beginning to bring about some positive change, including some of what Joseph Schumpeter aptly termed creative destruction. Second, much of the impetus for change will come from outside the academy, not within it. Universities will have to be nudged, maybe dragged into making changes by outside third parties who pay much of the bills. Third, 3 words beginning with the letter I hold the key to deal with some of these problems delineated at the beginning. Those 3 words are information, incentives, and innovation. Turning to my first point, markets reward success and punish firms failing to satisfy customers. Some firms die, other firms merge into more successful companies that can profitably expand the firm's franchise. I looked up for this presentation the top 10 companies on the Fortune 500 list for the year 1994, 23 years ago. 7 of those top companies have gone bankrupt, or at least once, or have had their name changed as a result of big mergers. One of the 3 who did survive was Ford Motor, and it had a near-death experience. It barely survived. The demise of companies is creative destruction. Market signals help reallocate resources to where they can be most productive by punishing laggards. In the year 2000, the number 18th largest corporation in the United States was Enron. In 2002, it did not exist. Poof. By contrast, the top 10 universities on the U.S. News Best College list from 1994 has changed very little. Some minor reordering of the top 10. And not one of them has had any transformative change. Government subsidies and private philanthropy help less successful universities survive. That said, market forces are starting to tangibly impact most universities. Total enrollments, as I say, have fallen for 6 years in a row. As costs rise and benefits fall, applications to colleges have stagnated. Many schools are finding it tough to reach planned enrollments, leading to budget crises. Tuition discounting continues to grow, so net tuition fees are not rising as rapidly as earlier. Indeed, some schools are experimenting with reducing sticker prices, a radical idea. The number of schools closing or merging with others is beginning to rise. Declining public support for higher ed makes it highly unlikely that big state or federal bailouts for universities are likely anytime soon. Still, universities resist major changes. Academic tenure makes faculty faculty just refuse to alter what they do. Why should they? I teach the same way I did 52 years ago, exactly, except I now use PowerPoint reluctantly once in a while and email, otherwise the same. University presidents often feel that high job security comes by keeping powerful members of the university community happy. Give the faculty low teaching loads, good parking, and decent salaries. Give the alumni great football teams. Give students light academic loads, high grades, and ignore their hedonistic excesses. I didn't know how to put that. Sometimes it would be called sex, drugs, and rock and roll, I guess. Give administrators huge salaries and multiple assistants to do their heavy lifting. All of this pushes up costs, creates a culture resistant to changes that lower costs or improves quality. Therefore, it usually will take some nudging from the outside for change to occur. At private schools, that includes actions from affluent alumni and friends. At state schools, from legislatures or, theoretically, the federal government. Some states, for example, are tying subsidy payments to improve student performance with highly mixed results. Some states have passed laws promoting free speech on campus and punishing schools not stopping protests that prevent free expression of ideas. Universities hate outside interference, often justifiably, I think, but sometimes they deal with these, unless they deal with these issues themselves, increased outside pressures are inevitable and perhaps maybe even desirable at some time. I was going to tell you a story about how economists are insensitive, but it's so bad of a joke and time is so limited, I'm going to skip it. Now, it's actually a pretty good joke that was told to me by a former university president. But alas, the 3 I's of reform. Universities are in the information and knowledge business. They often do not have, or at least disseminate, critical information necessary to make good decision making. Do they know, for example, whether the seniors have better critical reasoning skills than freshmen? Do you know that at Baylor? Do they know 6 months after graduation what % of English, economics, mathematics, art, or other majors have good jobs and what their average earnings are? Do they allocate university resources favoring those disciplines that seem to produce the most productive students based on the evaluations of the marketplace? What do we know about these students who drop out, for example, and why? Do we know our cost of maintaining a square foot of space and how it compares with peer universities? How does TCU and Baylor compare, for example? Do you know any of these things? No, probably not. The second I stands for incentives. In the private for-profit sector, there's enormous financial pressures on firms to reduce costs and improve quality, to innovate and change to avoid being weakened or destroyed. Competition in markets are tremendous financial incentives. In universities, the impact of markets is severely muted by government subsidies, and once students have enrolled in schools, the costs associated with transferring give universities some monopoly power, especially with respect to things like student housing. I got some great data on student housing, by the way. Universities are ripping students off, period. Managers in private firms are rewarded for reducing staff. When I was a department chair, I was financially rewarded for talking my dean into giving me another faculty position. I effectively lowered the productivity of the staff, one more person to do the same amount of work. However, I got huge raises that year. Why? Because my colleagues, we have a system where the colleagues evaluate their boss. And my colleagues thought I was great. So I got a big raise. Ever hear of that in the private sector where the employees rate the boss and determine his salary? Isn't that crazy? The man on this tie, Adam Smith, claimed that the quality of instruction in Oxford University fell when the students stopped paying professors directly and instead of paid tuition fees to the university. Maybe we should go part way back to that way of doing things. Pay the professors who perform well in the classroom. Maybe we should incentivize university presidents to reduce non-teaching staff, and so on. The third I stands for innovation. With the possible exception of prostitution, I know of no profession other than teaching where labor productivity has not risen in the 2,400 years since Socrates taught the youth of Athens. We use technology to supplement traditional modes of teaching most often rather than to replace them and reduce costs. Now, there's some signs that it is changing in some areas with online education and so forth. In my field of economics, couldn't we have, say, the 20 best teachers in the United States teach principles of economics for everyone in the country for most of the instruction? Maybe we ought to invert the process and have students learn largely on their own through good online tutorials and then use the professors to answer questions and strengthen their knowledge of concepts, works, and so on. We research all kinds of things in academia, but it's been relatively little researching the effectiveness of job one teaching students. There's a lot of ideas I could talk about. But the one I want to talk about the most is getting the federal government out of the student financial assistance business. The current system is Byzantine in its complexity, has led to fewer, not more, lower income students attending college. I repeat that. There is a smaller percentage of low income students graduating from college today than in 1970. 12% in the bottom quartile income distribution, 1970, 10% today. In spite of all this massive increase in federal aid, supposedly for low-income students. Now, there are some options out there, and we ought to be trying them. One of them, and I've met a gentleman here today, one of your professors who is enthusiastic about this as I am, is something called income share agreements, where students sell equity in themselves, a share of their post-college earnings for a contracted number of years. Risks of financing education are shifted from the student to private investors, and students with more likely possibilities of succeeding in college and in life will get better terms of financing, giving the market a market-based nudge to curricular reform. Remember, I talked about Purdue at the beginning. At the beginning of 2013, Mitch Daniels became president of that university, former governor of Indiana, formerly executive with Eli Lilly. He froze tuition fees and made that job number one is to keep tuition fees down. Next fall, for the 6th year in a row, the tuition fees will be the same. No change. In inflation-adjusted terms, they've fallen. Consequently, the proportion of income it takes to go to Purdue is falling now. Applications are soaring. The quality of the institution by most measures is up. But he did a lot of other things. He bought Kaplan University, a private for-profit, for $1, and he's making that into a public online university for Purdue. But he introduced income share agreements that I mentioned just a minute ago. Great idea. It's small, but it's growing, and it's working, as far as we can tell. His salary, in fact, I was called in to help negotiate his salary, by the way. I was actually a consultant to the board on his salary. And his salary is partly determined by his ability to achieve goals like greater affordability. He's being paid less a flat salary and more a variable salary, like stock option equivalents in the private sector. My time is up, but let me add, what will the future bring? I'm on record predicting at least 500 institutions will close their doors in the next decade. More students are asking, why should I pay $100,000 or $200,000 for a piece of paper denoting that I'm reasonably well educated or responsible or intelligent? Maybe there are cheaper ways of certifying competency around, and we should find them. Plato once said, we have a classical scholar here, so I'm trying to reach back into the past. Plato allegedly said, and although I'm an old guy, I'm not that old, so I don't know if he personally said this, that necessity is the mother of invention. But in the new educational world, we should see a modest revival in vocational education. We should see some new innovations as universities become increasingly tenuous financially. We should see more trainings of people to be plumbers, welders, home health care aides, and the like. In short, in some ultimate sense, higher ed will respond to pressures, to the impending crisis. It will respond bitterly and grudgingly, but it will respond, or much of it will die. Creative destruction is beginning to come to higher education. Thank you very much. Oh, before, by the way, we're going to take questions, but I did say I was going to have a commercial. You know, you just can't go more than 30 minutes without a commercial. My commercial here is a little peculiar, but it's an opportunity for students. I, along with a professor at Florida State University and one or two others, run a great program that is 1 week long, 5 days long actually, in classical liberal studies, in the study of the classical liberal tradition in economics, political science, and philosophy. at Severo Institute in Prague, Czech Republic, each year. The kids that go on this program have given it rave reviews over the years. I can show them to you if you want to see them. The cost to the students is $1,000 for room, board, tuition, airplane fare to Europe and back. It costs $3,000 a kid to put this program on. We charge the kids $1,000. A certain well-known American foundation has funded this. And if any of you are interested, come up and talk to me afterwards. It's a transformative experience for many students I met there. So that's just a little sideline I'll throw out. So with that, am I open for questions? What are we doing, Daniel? If you don't mind, I'm going to sit down. I'm an old man.
Also, if you didn't get a chance to sign up for our mailing list, please help us out by doing that, volunteering.
This is working. My question is, given the knowledge business, the acquisition of knowledge has changed a lot with the advent of the internet and knowledge being in the cloud, being able to be accessed by anyone with Google. In your opinion, how should the modern University of America bend to that or work with that?
Well, universities have not fully picked up on that because partly an incentive issue. I'm a teacher. What incentives are there for me to do anything different than the way I used to? I get paid either way. I enjoy the way I teach now. It's easy. It's I don't have to think much about changing things. I can use my same lecture notes 50 years in a row, as I have in some cases. Updated them a little bit here and there. So it's a scam that I have going that works well, so I can rip off taxpayers, as I have for 50-some years, and I continue to do so. So partly the incentives don't favor innovation and change. You're absolutely right. We should be moving forth much more than we are with this. There's an issue whether we should even have, I don't know that there's an issue whether we should have universities. I think universities, by the way, perform other functions, such as socialization functions, networking, and the residential experience is a valuable one, independent of what you learn. Even if you learn nothing, it still has its advantages. Some of those advantages are, as I say, maybe illegitimate. They're sort of hedonistic. But some of those advantages are very real and part of life. So, but getting back to the pure academic things, there's no reason why kids, is there any reason why kids need to go to college at all? Let me ask you this. What's your name, by the way? Stephen. Let me ask you this. Why shouldn't a kid, why shouldn't we be able to come up with a good 3-4 hour test? Well, you know, you take tests all the time. You took tests to get in here, didn't you? Don't you have to take the ACT or something to get in here? So you took a test to get in here. Why don't you take a test when you get out of here? And why doesn't that test measure your critical thinking skills, a little bit of your knowledge of basic things? Do you know how to add and subtract? Do you know how, you know who the form of government we have, things like that. Maybe a little bit about your major subject, maybe. A little bit of testing of critical thinking. We'll give you a problem to solve and then have you write an answer to it to get a little bit of your writing skills. Why don't we do this in a 3-hour test? We'll call it the National College Equivalence Exam. And when you get your grade, say you got an 89, you can say, I got an 89 on the NCEE. The average graduate at Harvard College got a 74. I'm smarter than the Harvard kids. Why in the hell don't you give me a better job than you give them, rather than whatever people do in Texas? as opposed to in those snooty eastern states. Like you, I live in flyover country, and so I see things. I think you're from flyover country. So why don't we do that? Why don't we come up with new ways of certifying competency? And maybe you don't need to go to college at all. Maybe you're bright, you read a lot. And at age 19, you can take this test and do well on it. And you can go to colleges and say, look I am cool. Look at my grades. They're high on this test. They're better than the average graduate at Texas Christian University and almost as good as those at Baylor. And why don't we do that? And the college may say, well, you're a little young, and also we'll pay you maybe $2,000 less than a college graduate because you don't have the maturity. But you can get a job early, and you can save a whole bunch of money. And I'm not saying that's the ultimate solution, but we ought to come up with solutions like that. There are others, you know, we should use MOOCs more. We should use all sorts of free online stuff that we don't use much. You should be able to, as I say, take tests to certify competency that we don't do. And of course, the accreditation agencies fight this tooth and nail. They don't want this stuff because they are owned and operated and run by the universities themselves, and they want to keep things the way they are, and they want to keep competition down, and they want to keep innovation down. So we ought to, you know, this is, I almost said this is the home of the Branch Davidians. I was going to get myself into deep trouble here. I better stay away from that analogy. But we ought to go in there, and I wouldn't say shoot up the accreditors, you know, but remember what Shakespeare said, kill all the lawyers. Maybe we should kill all the accreditors, and I mean it figuratively, not literally. And that would help a little bit. There's a lot of little things we can do along this line. Yes, sir.
With all that you have said,
Yeah.
and with your knowledge that you have of all this whole subject, do you know of any really rough, tough evaluation that projects what a university should look like in 20 years or 30 years? If not, why not? And if not, who should be put together to put that type of study together in reality?
It's a very good question. There are attempts by some who say, let's start all over on paper and come up what an ideal university should look like. That's kind of what you're asking. And there's a guy down in Texas, for example, or rather, I hate to say it, in a state whose name I usually don't mention in Texas, Oklahoma. There's a professor at Oklahoma State, dare I say OSU, who once claimed he could come up with a good undergraduate education for $7,800 a student without public subsidy at all. And he came up with a curriculum. You do a lot of things that are sort of simple. You don't allow 110 majors and 12,000 different courses. You have a simple curriculum with maybe 15 majors and 100 courses, 200. So that simplifies things a lot. And we don't teach some things that some of us hold dear, including probably what I teach, what my colleague over here, he teaches Roman history, which I happen to love Roman history, but maybe we could live without Roman history in this $7,800 world of ours. And so there are a few others that are doing things like that. But there's very little of that. There isn't enough of that. There's not enough forward thinking, partly because of the incentive problems I've mentioned. How do I get ahead as I'm not a young professor, but some of these professors who are about the square root of my age, when I started teaching, these kids were minus 31, minus 32, negative numbers. How can we incentivize professors and others in the academy to want to be more innovative? I get no incentive for being innovative. I get incentives for writing papers for the Explorations in Economic History, which is actually a pretty good little journal. And there are 700 or 800 people who subscribe to it. Maybe 50 who actually read it, because most of those copies go to libraries where they sit on shelves. By the way, do we even need libraries anymore? I think we do, but why? Why do we need libraries? Everything's on the internet these days. Why do we need libraries? We need to go back to first principles, but we need to change the incentives. And the federal government and the state governments make us avoid those hard questions, ask the questions you're doing, because they let us keep doing things the way we're doing them now, maybe making little minor changes here and there to save a little money and whatnot. But on the whole, the costs have gone up rather than down because these subsidies have continued to increase. And people are, as I say, we're starting to catch on with this. It's the subsidies are starting to level off a little bit, and the costs are getting high in relation to the benefits, and we're starting to get some market reaction. That's kind of cool and kind of good, but it's still very much, I think higher ed is a private good mostly, not a public good. A private good means the main beneficiaries of going to college are the kids who go to college. They benefit in numerous ways. Does society as a whole benefit? We like to think so. The higher education establishment tells us so. But where is the proof? I looked at the relationship between state appropriations on higher education and economic growth, and I see no relationship at all. In fact, if I see any relationship, it's the opposite. The more states spend on higher ed, the lower the economic growth, because you're taking money away from hardworking taxpayers who are incentivized by a very efficient private free enterprise system, and you're giving it to people like me who have tenure, who teach whatever I want, write my article for the Journal of Last Resort, teach trivial number of students a year for a salary in the 6 digits. Is that smart? I don't think so. By the way, being retired, I can become a radical, because up to this point I've been ripping off the taxpayers.
So bottom line, there is no one group or organization that, hit my question, really working on the issue. Is that what you're saying?
You know, we're starting to get reform groups are starting to talk about it. There are people saying this problem needs to be solved. And America is pretty good, as you know. We're a great society at inventing and overcoming adversity. And I think we are starting to. Plato was right. Necessity is the mother of invention. We're starting to see some signs. We're starting to see think tanks come up with some new ideas. We're starting to see legislators say no to some things that they should have been saying no. The typical state legislature is clueless. They don't know what the teaching loads are. They don't know what the heck is going on at UT or at A&M. Why is UT, with $20-some billion in endowment, charging $10,000 to go to Austin? Why don't they charge zero? Why don't they use that money to make it zero? They could. I've done the math. It's possible. That's why I'm not welcome in Austin, and it's very dangerous for me to be there at night. But the same thing is true of A&M too, although only half's true because they don't get quite as much money. The University of Texas has more endowment than, by a factor of 2, than any other public university in the United States. They have twice the endowment because of what's called permanent fund, or whatever it is, whatever the name of it is. And yet they charge about the same as the other schools. And they have the most grandiose buildings I've ever seen anywhere, because they use that endowment to build fancy buildings. Instead of using linoleum on the floors, they put in marble. What's wrong with linoleum? You know what I'm saying? Just can't we do things to maximize, do what Mitch Daniels does. Make the goal to make college more affordable. That would be one thing. We could do some other things too, but that would be one thing. And if we did that, we wouldn't need federal student loans. We wouldn't need that. Other problem is the federal government. The federal government mingles. Today, this morning, I learned on the internet that the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, has 2 active civil rights investigations going on at Baylor University as a result of a complaint filed on November 18th, 2016. 17, rather. 16. A year ago. 2 complaints. The government issued this list of it, and so they're going to be harassing Baylor. These relate to sexual harassment issues, and Baylor is not alone. There were 2,155 investigations going on by the U.S. Department of Education. The very strength of American higher ed has come because we have all this decentralized schools. We have schools like Baylor who are faith-based, taking one approach. We have other schools like A&M taking another approach to higher education. You can go to Trinity in San Antonio and get a third approach. You can go everywhere and get the kind of higher ed you want. It's diversity, it's competition, it's cool. And we have no central education ministry telling us what to teach, how much to teach, what to pay our professors, etc. But we're starting to get away from that, and we're going to the centralized model of Germany and other European countries. I think that's a huge mistake, a huge mistake. And I think we should do something about it. I don't know what we should do. Maybe we can have a protest in front of it. Yeah, Daniel, take another question. I'm starting to get riled up here.
Hi. So you mentioned income share agreements a moment ago, and so I was just wanting to know if you think it'd be better provided by the universities or by private investors.
Well, I don't care. I think it should be provided by someone. I think private investors, I think it's a cool idea to have private investors do it. We had before, at one time, hundreds of billions of dollars. Even now, we have about $100 and some billion of private lending, purely private lending to students going on. And there's some probably that's going on we don't know about. Parents will go out and take a home equity loan on their house to help their kid go to school. We don't know about that we don't call that a college loan, but it really is. So we have a vibrant private interest in making loans. Anyone who owns stock in, say, J.P. Morgan Chase, which closed yesterday at an all-time high, knows that there's money to be made in lending. Why can't and there's money to be made in investing, in equity investments. The Dow hit 26,000 yesterday. Why can't we make money in investing in kids? And I think universities doing it's kind of cool because then they have skin in the game. Universities don't have any skin in the game. Under the federal student loan program, they go make loans to all kinds of kids they know won't pay those loans back. They say, we don't care. The kids will default on the loans and the taxpayers will pay, not the universities. What if we said to the universities, you're going to have to pay at least a quarter of that back yourself. You were responsible for making that happen, so you should pay. So they ought to have skin in the game. That would be something we could do. There's a lot of things we could do. It's applying market-based principles to government, to higher ed. And I'm all for income and share agreements getting a fair shake. We have not given them a fair shake in this country. There are some legal issues to be discussed. There are some governmental rules we have to, enforcing contracts and so on. It's not, there's some little things that need to happen, but they're not expensive and they're easy to do. And they would be a good substitute for the federal government doing it.
I had a question. You mentioned about the percentage of low-income students has actually dropped, where it seems that the goal of government aid is to get more people in education, especially those who normally would not be able to afford it. But do you think that any of that is due to possibly like the lower percentage of Americans who are low income, or is it all like is that a
Well,
factor at all?
it's no doubt true. It is true that there has been a redistribution of income in the United States in the last 40 years. That's true. The standard statistics, like the Gini coefficient that you look at, have shown a greater gap between the rich and the poor. But we're talking about the bottom 25%. There's always been a bottom 25%. The bottom 25% 40 years ago were 12% went to college, 12% college students were from that group. That's 25% of the population, but only 12% of the students. Now it's down to 10. 25% has always been 25%. It is true that the poor today, it may be true that the poor today are a little poorer than then. Although the poverty rate in the United States, you use that as a sort of a rough and ready measure, the poverty rate in the United States reached an all-time low, the official poverty rate, 11.1% in 1973. And it is a little higher today, but it's about 12% or 13%. There's not a dramatic change. You know, income distribution can impact college attendance. I don't think there's any difference. But I don't want to get going on this because I get passionate. The poverty rate in the United States among people who do not work is 31%. The poverty rate in the United States for people who work part-time, occasionally during the year, in the 10 to 15% range. I don't remember the exact figure. The poverty rate for people who work full-time year-round in the United States is 2.1%. The vast majority of poor people in the United States are poor because they're not working. And I'm not maligning them. I'm not saying there may be good reasons they're not working, but that's, you know, the reality. We want to put people to work in this country, and I think higher ed should be working for that goal. And indeed, a lot of these things I'm talking about today were with that in mind. Let's push majors, which are more job, you know, where kids get jobs easier and whatnot. My daughter went to Northwestern University. It cost $60,000 a year to send her there, or something like that. It was a little lower when she went 15 years ago or so. And what was her first job after graduation? Well, she worked at the Flat Top Grill in Chicago, which is a moderately yuppie restaurant, as a waitress. Why? She majored in theater performance. You know, I love the girl, still do. And on the side, she did acts at Second City in Chicago, making fun of her parents. But I still loved her. But she was a theater major. I think we need theater majors in society. But should we be subsidizing? Should we not be putting our resources into where it will serve society, where society has indicated through the decisions of buyers and sellers that we're going to get, you know, they're going to earn more money? Why do petroleum engineers in Texas I know this, I've seen these numbers for Colorado. Petroleum engineers in Colorado start at $175,000 a year. And the starting earnings in gender studies, I think it was under $30,000 a year. Same, roughly, probably the same cost. Now, I have nothing against gender studies, but if we're trying to maximize the return society gets from education, we might want to rethink that. At least we want to tell students what those numbers are. Time is probably up. Daniel, what do you?
Maybe one more short question, or we can.
Yeah, I'll be short. You know, professors talking 50-minute sound bites, and.
So I was wondering what you think the reason why we aren't already seeing market solutions to some of the problems you've discussed, whether it be certification tests or lean universities. whether it's a barrier to entry problem or if it's a consumer preference problem. Maybe it's an issue that students just don't want lean universities. Maybe students want to go to a school that has a successful football team, fancy dorms, those types of things.
Big atriums like this building. Yeah, I love this building, by the way. I don't know how much more the cost of going to Baylor went up when you built this building. It's a gorgeous building, but that's a good question. I don't know for sure. I know the answer to that question. One thing it's interesting, kids that go to college are about the only, make the only expenditure I can think of where they're not, it's not them, it's their parents that are usually paying a lot of the bills. And at age 18, what the hell do you know about anything? I mean, you have never had made an expenditure of more than $100 in your life, probably, or 1,000 or two, maybe. Bought a used car or something. How in the heck can you make a $100,000 decision about higher education or $200,000? So you rely on your parents, and your parents are paying much of the bill. So part of the insensitivity to the cost is because someone else is picking it up, and you've never had to worry much about it. And that's life. I mean, that's the way it is. That's part of the maturation, part of the process of growing up. It's part of maturity. It's part of the transition from adolescence to adulthood. But it does mean that, that sometimes market forces have to work maybe a little slower and so forth. I have enjoyed this visit very much. I want to thank you very much for letting me come and speak to you. I will be around, I guess, for a few more minutes. I don't know. Professor Bennett will have to tell. But, and if any of you afterwards, and I was serious about this, if you're interested in my little Prague program, come up here. We have a heck of a good time in Prague, too. We learn a lot. We work hard and play hard while we're in Prague. And if any of you are interested in it, come up and I can fill you in on it. It's a great program. Thank you very much.